European governments that are talking about how wonderful the South African government is right now are lying to you. For those of us on the outside, for those of us in the rest of the world, South Africa's policy is not only immoral but self-destructive.
You're watching WORLDVIEW, the #1 media company where we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Is the end of the government of national unity nigh? We witnessed a historic vote to postpone the budget speech, with parties outside the ANC in the GNU expressing frustration, particularly after being sidelined and forced to approve a VAT increase. For interest's sake, this entire spectacle, which WORLDVIEW attended in person, cost the South African taxpayer close to 4 to 5 million rand, just so the political parties could make a stunt, and it's probably going to happen again. At the budget speech, I asked several parliamentarians, did Donald Trump have anything to do with this? And they all denied it. Why would Donald Trump have anything to do with a domestic budget speech issue? It's nonsense. Well, our next guest disagrees. Joel Pollak was born in Johannesburg and later moved to the US, where with his studies and experience shaped him to the position where he is currently as the chief senior editor at large at Breitbart News. What makes him particularly interesting is that he is supposedly the frontrunner to be the next US ambassador to South Africa. So Joel, welcome to the show. It's such a great honor and privilege to have you on.
Good to be with you. I'll just say I don't know anything about the ambassadorship, so
it's all speculation.
I cannot say one way or the other.
And how do you think that arose? Is it just someone feeding the media in the United States?
No. I've been told that I'm on a very short list of candidates, and that's all I know.
And just quickly, in terms of, because I know you're struggling with a situation currently in California, the wildfires. Any update there? Are you guys okay over there? I thought this would have been sorted by now.
Well, when things burn and they stop burning, in a sense, yeah, the fire is over, but the rebuilding process can take years, and so that's what we're dealing with at the moment. My family and I are displaced. We still have our home. Our house is still standing. It's one of the only ones in our particular neighborhood. But we cannot go back to our neighborhood at the moment. There are no services available except for electricity. They managed to turn that back on, but there's no water. There's no gas for heating or for cooking. And there are other services that aren't there. Plus, if you go there now in the middle of the day, you'll find a huge traffic jam, even though there are very few residents living there. And that's because there are all kinds of trucks and bulldozers and earth-moving machines and all kinds of other things. And that's a good thing. It means that they're clearing the debris and they're going to start rebuilding homes and other institutions. But it's a massive process. And meanwhile, there are thousands of families like mine who are still displaced. 72% of the people in Pacific Palisades lost their homes. So they have a much more difficult process, I think, emotionally. We have a more difficult process in terms of insurance. We actually have fire insurance. Many people lost their fire insurance in recent months for reasons we can go into if you're interested. But for those of us with standing homes, we have a fight with the insurance company to see what they're going to cover in terms of expenses. If your house burns down, it's rather simple. You don't have a house anymore, so they give you the money that you're owed. And if your house is still standing, then you have an interesting negotiation over what the company will pay for, whether they'll remediate the smoke damage. In our case, the fence around our house was largely burnt down, so that's quite obvious in terms of needing to be replaced and so forth. But receiving all kinds of forensic reports about the damage to the rest of the house. The fence burning caused some significant charring to one side of the house. So a long journey still ahead, but in the meantime, we're just managing our routine as best we can.
Shame, Joel. You're in South Africa. We like to moan, but I mean, definitely your situation is, really not good. I really hope the best.
Los Angeles is run almost like a third world country. And I saw a comment today that the reason the Democratic Party in the United States lost the election last year was because they were trying to turn into the ANC. There really are parallels between the Democratic Party in the US and the way the ANC runs South Africa. And that is a fixation on race, a fixation on redistribution, and in some ways, if you want to put it in a positive light, an attachment to utopian visions of what a beautiful world could look like, but a complete detachment from reality. For example, in the name of utopia, California, the state that Los Angeles is located in, is mandating that people buy electric vehicles. It is going to be illegal to sell a petrol fuel vehicle in the year 2035. That's 10 years from now.
Wow.
They want to move everyone to electric vehicles. But the problem is, in a fire, electric vehicles have lithium-ion batteries that create hazardous material when they're burned, and they can actually explode. So now they have to do the very careful job of removing all of these electric vehicles from people's homes because they are considered hazardous. And that delays the process of removing the debris and rebuilding the homes. So in the name of environmental utopia, we have these electric vehicles that are now, we are finding out, quite dangerous to human beings and dangerous to the environment in this situation.
Yeah.
Similarly, we have all kinds of restrictions on carbon emissions because we're told that climate change requires that we cut back on our use of fossil fuels and carbon and so forth. But California has been producing much more carbon because of the fires that we've been having over the last 20 years. You can blame climate change for the fires, but the fact is that the fires are contributing more to climate change and to carbon emissions than any of the energy-saving things that we are doing or any of the switch to renewable energy sources. So we have these utopian visions of an environmental future, but they completely contradict the reality that we're facing. And I think that's something the Democrats in the United States have in common with the ANC. And it's interesting. I mean, having lived in both countries, you can really feel the parallels. And I think there's an awakening happening. I don't know how wide it goes, but many of my neighbors are realizing that unless you take care of the basic things, basic protection of people's safety and property, you're really not performing your function as government. You can say that you've met certain goals and benchmarks and so forth, but if there's a fire and you don't have water to put out the fire and you don't have police to direct the evacuation, you're not succeeding.
I think that's one of the understated issues with affirmative action. It's not necessarily that you get someone that you don't like in a senior position, but that the entire system collapses. What happened in South Africa? I mean, just every single state institution just collapsed because you put people there who are not there based on merit. And I think a lot of people, perhaps in the United States, don't understand that. It's not necessarily just having someone there that you don't like. It's like the entire system can just poof. Engineers that are not supposed to be there. The list goes on. Electricity utility collapsed, and
yeah, there's a debate here as to the role of affirmative action in the fires. Many people feel that the city prioritized, well, it's not so much about race, but really a general concept of what we call diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, and there was a fixation on gender and on sexuality. So there's been some criticism that the fire department was more interested in hiring lesbian women to certain posts, whether they could do the posts or not, do the jobs or not. I don't know how true that is. And generally in my coverage of the fires, I've tended to set that issue aside because I think the problems in the system here existed beyond that. For example, we had a reservoir above Pacific Palisades that holds 117 million gallons. I would guess that's about 600 million liters of water. And it was largely empty at the time of the fire. Now, maybe DEI played a role in the management at the water company not noticing. But more likely it was that there just didn't seem to be any kind of preparation for a wildfire. The system was designed for individual house fires. So the thinking was, well, we don't need that reservoir now. The residents of Pacific Palisades, that part of Los Angeles that burned, they can tap into the water system for the rest of Los Angeles for their daily needs, for their washing, bathing, drinking. And if there's a fire at one house, we certainly have enough water for one house. but they didn't think that a wildfire was possible. And so even if they had enough water, at some point there would have been a pressure problem in the system, as there was in Pasadena on the other side of town, which had another fire at the same time called the Eaton Fire. There they had adequate supplies of water, but when so many people are using the water at the same time, it creates a pressure problem in the system. Most water systems rely on gravity to move water through the system. And if you're opening the taps in a massive way, you create a sudden drawdown of pressure that makes the water within the system flow at a slower rate. And the water actually needs to flow at a very fast rate within the system to power the fire hydrants for the fire department to push the water through the hoses. So if you don't have enough water pressure to actually operate the hoses, then it doesn't matter if you have enough water in the system. It's the pressure that really is needed. And so it was an overall system design, and that goes back 50 or 60 years, far earlier than we had these affirmative action policies and DEI policies. So that may have played a role, the DEI stuff, but it's really a system design issue. And what I'm proposing in the future is that we have a decentralized system of water storage, because wildfires, we now know, are a risk. And some of us, myself included, were warning beforehand that it was a risk. I, as a journalist, have covered many fires, water policy issues in California, and I've been saying for a long time that we have a risk, serious risk of wildfire, even in urban Los Angeles, because of our proximity to the forest and the mountains and things that make our area very beautiful, but also make it somewhat risky. I mean, if you live in Cape Town, you're aware of this every day. You live near Table Mountain, you live near the Cape Peninsula, you live near wilderness, in a sense. And so you know that there are risks of wildfires. And so there's a lot of public education in South Africa about fire management. That's something we should really follow in the United States. It doesn't prevent all fires, but it does prevent some. And we don't really have a lot of public education, at least in California, about fire safety. But those of us who understand the issue have been warning about it for some time. But the system was not designed with that in mind. And so you have to make changes. Now, when you have DEI policies in place, they become priorities that may interfere with the more urgent priority of public safety. And that's basically the problem. So as you say, when you have these policies in place, it's not so much the individual case. It's very difficult to point to one official usually and say, well, this person has their job because of affirmative action and they're doing a bad job. I mean, you can find people doing a bad job of all backgrounds, colors, whatever. But it does weaken the system because it places other priorities in front of whatever it is you're trying to achieve.
Absolutely. You mentioned that you like decentralization. That's what you would like to see there in California. Coming back to South Africa, and especially the Western Cape, I believe you've spoken favorably about DA governance here in the Western Cape. And you see, if I understand you correctly, that model should be replicated across South Africa. That's the solution for South Africa, combining that with federalism, more power to the provinces. Can you expand on that, perhaps?
Well, it's a question of power to the provinces, but also once an experiment is successful, you should replicate it elsewhere. If you go back 25 years to the year 2000, which is the year I arrived in South Africa as a Rotary Scholar, and you start all the provinces at the same baseline of 2000, and then you look at where they are today and why. You know, I was in South Africa recently, and to drive around the Western Cape roads and just experience the Western Cape province versus to drive around Limpopo, you know, which used to be Northern Province or whatever. You know, it's so different in terms of the quality of the road, or even just to drive around Johannesburg from one year to the next. I was in Johannesburg in 2022, and there were one or two traffic lights that didn't work. A year later in 2023, there were one or two traffic lights that did work. And the decline is pretty shocking.
Yeah.
But in Cape Town and the Western Cape, there are problems, but there are also things that have improved since 2000. If you look at infrastructure, if you look at public transportation, some things have not improved. And those are things over which the local and provincial government have not had control. But the things that the local and provincial government have been able to control have generally improved. So the reason federalism is the answer in South Africa is the same reason it's the answer in the United States. When something works in one of the states, other states try it. So what you have in South Africa is a successful experiment, mostly in the Western Cape, and it can be replicated in other parts of South Africa. but you have to have the ruling party agree to replicate it. You have to have them agree to repeat the experiment. And that's a question of political will.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. And it's interesting you mentioned the sort of the contrast between a place like Limpopo and the Western Cape. Recently, I saw an article by Henry Tucker. He's a former U.S. Republican State Executive Committee man. It's a massive title, but he wrote this article in response to your idea of federalism being spread across South Africa. And he says federalism isn't necessarily the solution, because if you give more powers to the Western Cape might just become more and more of a quote-unquote utopia, and everyone in South Africa might just flee to the country, to the province and overwhelm it. He says the best solution for the Western Cape is just complete out independence, Cape independence. What do you think of that? There are people arguing for Cape independence, but the disparity, the contrast between the Western Cape and the rest of South Africa is so huge. Just split the country off, the province off.
It seems unlikely to me that would happen, but if you don't want that to happen, you have to repeat the Western Cape's successful policies in other places. I mean, I'll give you an example over the longer term in the United States. In the mid-20th century, there was a massive migration of people out of the American South and into the American North, because the American North had manufacturing industries. And many people, particularly Black people, left the South, which they hadn't left even after the Civil War, but they left in the 20th century, mid-20th century, and perhaps it was fueled a bit by the production in the Second World War, but they moved north. It was a great migration, and it caused all kinds of interesting social changes and so forth, but essentially it was driven by the fact that there were manufacturing opportunities in the north. Over time, the northern states and cities became heavily unionized, and the cost of labor went up. And companies started moving to the South, where there were new governments that were elected really starting in the 1980s, 1990s, new governments in a kind of post-racial American South who prioritized economic growth, and they made conditions very favorable for manufacturing in the South. So many of the major international automotive companies set up manufacturing plants in South Carolina, in Tennessee, in other places. And there's now been a migration in exactly the opposite direction, including Black Americans moving back south because manufacturing is working in the South and it isn't in the North. And why? Because one key law that the South has that the North does not have is called the right to work. The right to work means that workers who obtain jobs in factories don't have to join a union. If you can just work for a living, then it's easier to find a job. If you have to join a union, the unions become very powerful, and they can raise the costs to employers, the cost of wages, the cost of benefits, and they make production costly. So the North has these right to work bans. In other words, you have to join a union. Or they have like closed shop. There are different terms for it, but essentially in the old industrial cities and states of the North, you have to join a union, and therefore the unions are very powerful in many of these industries. But in the South, they have right to work laws, so people migrate. Now, when that began happening, people in some northern states looked at what was happening and said, you know what, we have to change our laws. We cannot actually operate this way. And so states like Michigan, for a while anyway, adopted right to work laws to stop the outflow of people. So when you see the results of the federalist experiment, you can actually change your policies. And so I'm not worried that giving more autonomy to the Western Cape and other provinces would necessarily cause South Africa to disintegrate or to splinter apart. But you do need the political will in other provinces to change the way they've been doing things. And really, you need political will in the country overall.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting point. The reason why I mentioned this, I think a lot of South Africans are just very confused about this new Afrikaner refugee story. And the majority of the people in the Western Cape are Afrikaners, and they want a referendum on Cape independence, according to latest polling. So I don't know what the United States has in mind. What is the plan there? So yeah, I mentioned this as a middle way solution.
I don't think there's really any thought been given to it in the United States. I mean, I think that people have thought about it perhaps in a theoretical way, but I don't think the United States has any sort of policy about it.
So to just mention that without, okay, what are we going to do about it?
Well, we deal with this issue with Canada. I mean, Canada has a separatist movement in Quebec. French-speaking Canadians have wanted to secede. They narrowly voted not to secede back in the 1990s. And it's an issue. I mean, if Canada sees Quebec become its own province for cultural reasons and other reasons, it's going to create some problems. You've heard Donald Trump say that Canada should be the 51st state, and people assume he's joking. But actually, there's a real prospect that if Quebec secedes, that the eastern provinces of Canada, east of Quebec, like Nova Scotia, that they will become part of the United States. They've actually expressed that desire. I don't know if that's still the case, but the easternmost provinces of Canada don't want to be cut off from the rest of Canada. So there is actually a reasonable prospect of at least part of Canada becoming the United States if Quebec declares independence. So there are all kinds of complications for that sort of movement to think about. I mean, I think the frustration in the Western Cape is that there are so many services in the Western Cape that are governed by the national government that don't work.
Yeah.
A few years ago, when there was a water crisis in Cape Town, people learned that even though they lived near a dam, a reservoir, a water treatment plant, a power plant, whatever, hydroelectric facility, that essentially water authority in South Africa is a national power. Or Transnet, the trains are run by the national government. I mean, when I was living in Cape Town 25 years ago, people in the townships would regularly take the train to work in the city. And it's my understanding now that the train basically doesn't work at all because there are tents and so forth. I mean, that's because of the failures at the national level, and it affects the quality of life for local people, and there's nothing they can do about it. So you've seen Cape Town and the Western Cape begin to move toward independent water policy and an independent energy policy, and all of that is good. I think the frustration is that there are still so many things that affect the lifestyle of people in the Western Cape that are controlled by the national government, and that the national government isn't improving those things. I mean, I think it would be a different issue if the national government were adopting different policies. Again, if you have political change at the top, and I'm not going to take a position one way or another, I don't think it's the place of Americans to tell South Africans how to vote, although I've made some of my opinions pretty clear. But I think that it can change the policy no matter what party you are. You can change the policies that aren't working.
AGOA. There's a lot of talk in South Africa of we're imminently going to be removed from AGOA, trade agreement with the United States, and that we will be removed from it based on our current policy positions in terms of Iran and Israel's stance in the International Court of Justice. Do you see us being removed from AGOA?
I think that South Africa is likely to be removed on the present course unless it changes its policies. It's also likely that AGOA will no longer exist. It's up for renewal as a whole in September. So the question of whether South Africa is included or not may actually be a moot point by the time we arrive at the end of September. But there are opportunities to renew AGOA and to include South Africa, again, given some really important policy changes and concessions. And I think the present criticism that you're seeing from President Donald Trump, instead of being seen as a negative, should be seen as an opportunity to make some changes and to reach a better agreement or a better situation for South Africa and the United States.
Joel, I see we're running out of time. Thank you so much for this opportunity. We covered a lot of interesting subjects, potential solutions for South Africa, and I think our viewers can take away a lot from this. Is there anything you want to leave our viewers with before we conclude? Just a sense that I think there's a lot we can learn from each other. The United States and South Africa have a lot in common. I also would just add that South Africa's foreign policy has been a problem for the United States, increasingly so, and that the South African government's support for Iran and especially its case against Israel in the International Court of Justice has been a real problem. And now that there's a ceasefire in Gaza, there's an opportunity for South Africa to withdraw that case and to reset its policy to stop supporting terrorists effectively against Western democracies
For those of us on the outside, for those of us in the rest of the world, South Africa's policy is not only immoral but self-destructive. And it's offensive to many people that South Africa has taken the position it has. But it's also self-destructive because when you argue in the International Court of Justice that there are some causes for which murdering innocent people can be justified, then you have a real problem telling people at home that they need to obey the law, that murder is wrong, that we need to have law and order. You're basically creating an immoral standard. And so I think it's self-destructive for South Africa to take the position it has, but it also encourages the Palestinians to continue pursuing violence and terrorism. The Palestinians started the war on October 7th, 2023. They've lost the war. You don't get special privileges because you lose a war that you start. And they didn't just start a war, they started a war against civilians. And as you and I are speaking today, they're burying, or first examining and then burying, the remains of 4 Israeli civilians, innocent people, elderly people, babies, among these 4 who were taken hostage on October 7th. This is a really important issue for the Trump administration. It's an important issue for many of us to see that South Africa changes its position, because many people will have nothing to do with South Africa if it continues on this present course. It's not that this issue is more important than other issues. We didn't discuss it first in our discussion, and that's because there are more pressing issues. But as a symbol of where South Africa is going, there's no more important issue. You cannot side with terrorists against innocent civilians. That has to stop.
Just quickly, out of interest sake, Joel, why do you think, it seems to me, solely an the Americans, the United States, pushing this new policy towards South Africa? Do you see the UK, for example, or Australia or New Zealand also taking this position? Because it seems to me only Donald Trump that's now taking this hardline position against South Africa. Do you see other Western countries joining suit?
Yes. Most of the rest of the world, keep in mind, is governed by the same rules of political correctness. The European nations tell you one thing and do another. They want to be seen as supporting the South African government because it's an African government. But they understand the problems, and they are afraid of being accused of racism if they criticize the South African government. Donald Trump is not afraid. That's the difference. European governments that are talking about how wonderful the South African government is right now are lying to you. They are lying to you. They don't have as much at stake as the United States, and they are incapable. Let me put it this way. Our Vice President, J.D. Vance, went to Germany last week and told them to stop prosecuting people for freedom of speech. You can actually be thrown in jail in Germany for saying the wrong thing, for insulting someone online. And the range of speech crimes is really quite staggering.
Yeah, and it's funny that they then accuse him of sort of promoting Nazism for fighting in favor of free speech. That's crazy.
The Nazis suppressed free speech. They didn't have free speech. But you cannot trust anything that comes out of a government where people can't speak their minds freely. So, these EU countries that want to say whatever they say about South Africa, how do you know that what they're saying is real? If you can be prosecuted for saying the wrong thing. So I think you can trust that Donald Trump is telling you the truth about how he views South Africa, how many in the West view South Africa, and it's a problem. You can change that perception by changing policies. But it's not as if it's just a problem for the United States. It's just that Donald Trump's the only world leader who's going to be honest about it.